What does it take for a man of cold logic and hard grief to fall to his knees? For Elias Thorne, it was not a gentle sermon or a reasoned argument that broke the walls he had built around his heart. It was a raging storm, a speeding midnight train, and a marble statue of the Virgin Mary that refused to stay where it was put. His story began not with faith, but with the echo of its absence, a silence in his soul so profound it felt like a physical weight. He was a man who believed only in stress points, load capacities, and the unforgiving certainty of physics, until the night physics itself seemed to bend to a will far greater than his own. Elias lived his life by the rigid lines of railroad tracks. He was once a respected civil engineer who designed bridges that defied gravity, structures of steel and concrete that sang a hymn to human reason. But after his wife, Anna, had passed, the music in his life went silent. The grief had been a landslide, sweeping away his ambition, his joy, and the quiet faith his wife had so cherished. He took a lesser job, a quiet punishment he inflicted upon himself, becoming the sole signalman at the quiet, forgotten crossing of St. Jude's Parish. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the world was reduced to the rumble of approaching trains and the lonely cry of the crossing bell. His small signal box was his fortress, a glass-walled cage where he could watch the world without having to participate in it. Inside, everything was order and function. Levers gleamed with oil, gauges gave their honest, unfeeling readings, and the telegraph clicked with predictable rhythms. Outside, however, was the world of St. Jude's, a world of messy, unpredictable faith that Elias had come to resent. It was the world that had taken Anna from him, a world of prayers she had believed were answered, even in the end. The object of the town's current devotion, and Elias's particular scorn, was a statue. It was an old marble carving of the Madonna, standing in a neglected grotto at the edge of the parish woods, not far from the tracks. It had been there for generations, its serene face weathered by a century of sun and snow, its stone robes covered in a fine green dust of moss. To Elias, it was just a mass of calcium carbonate, a testament to superstition, an idol of sentimentality that his wife had loved. He often saw her in his memory, placing wildflowers at its base, her head bowed in silent communion. The memory was a fresh wound every time it surfaced. The town's faith was embodied by Maria, a woman whose face was a roadmap of gentle wrinkles, and whose grandson, Leo, was never far from her side. It was Maria who approached Elias one afternoon, her hands clasped with a nervous hope that irritated him. The parish wanted to move the statue from the damp, forgotten grotto to a place of honor by the church's main entrance. They had volunteers, they had ropes, but they lacked the knowledge to move such a heavy, delicate object safely. They needed an engineer. They needed him. Elias almost laughed. He looked from her earnest face to the small group of hopeful parishioners gathered behind her. They looked at him as if he were a miracle worker, a man who could command stone. "It is just rock, Maria," he had said, his voice flat and dismissive. "A heavy, poorly balanced piece of rock. It has no power. It feels no honor." His words were meant to be cruel, to extinguish the foolish light in their eyes. But Maria simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile that pricked at his conscience. "To you, perhaps, it is rock," she replied softly. "To us, it is a reminder of a mother's love. We only want to bring her out of the shadows. Will you not help?" Sarcasm was Elias's shield. "And what if your mother does not wish to be moved? What if she cracks under the strain? Will you blame the engineer or the weak faith of your ropes?" He mocked them, but something in their quiet dignity, in the unshakable hope in their eyes, goaded him. It was a challenge to his professional pride. He saw their crude plans, their thick ropes and wooden dolly. It was a disaster waiting to happen. He would help them, not out of kindness, but to prove a point. He would show them the cold, hard mechanics of their world, and how their faith was no match for the simple laws of mass and gravity. He would be their engineer, but he would not be their believer. The day of the move was overcast, the sky a bruised purple that threatened rain. Elias directed the small team with the curt, impersonal efficiency of a site foreman. He checked their knots, measured the angles, and scoffed at their gentle, prayerful handling of the statue. To them, they were lifting a sacred icon. To him, they were hauling 2 tons of sculpted marble across uneven ground. He felt a bitter satisfaction in his own competence, a stark contrast to their well-meaning but clumsy efforts. They managed to lift the statue onto a heavy, wheeled dolly he had designed, a simple but effective platform. The journey from the grotto was slow and arduous. The men strained, their faces red with effort, while the women walked alongside, murmuring prayers under their breath. Elias walked ahead, clearing the path, his eyes on the ground, on the physics of the problem, refusing to look at the serene marble face that was now just inches from him. It looked so much like Anna had when she prayed, a look of peaceful surrender he could no longer comprehend. They were halfway to the church, crossing the small, unpaved service road that ran parallel to the railway tracks, when it happened. The ground, softened by days of damp weather, gave way under one of the dolly's iron wheels. There was a sickening lurch, a splintering crack of old wood, and a collective gasp from the crowd. The dolly tilted violently. Ropes snapped taut, and the men holding them were thrown to the ground. Silence fell, broken only by the panting breaths of the workers and the distant rumble of thunder. The statue had slid from the broken platform. It now lay precariously on its side, its heavy marble base half buried in the soft earth, its upper body leaning directly over the inner rail of the northbound track. It was a scene of perfect failure. It was exactly the kind of disaster Elias, in his arrogance, had silently predicted. He had wanted to teach them a lesson about the foolishness of their faith, but now he was standing in the middle of his own failed equation. The parishioners looked at him, their faces a mixture of fear and accusation. Mayor Thompson, a pragmatic man who had viewed the entire endeavor with skepticism, was the first to speak, his voice sharp with recrimination. "Well, Thorne, what now? You were in charge. There's a passenger express due in 3 hours. That thing is fouling the line." Elias felt a cold fury rise within him. He was being blamed for their sentimental project. "It was your dolly that broke," he shot back, his voice colder than the coming rain. "Your foolish insistence on moving this thing." He gestured at the fallen Madonna with contempt. She lay there like a casualty of war, her marble hand outstretched as if pleading. He ignored the sight. Logic was his refuge. He assessed the situation. The base was embedded deep in the mud. The weight was immense. Without heavy lifting equipment, which would take hours, if not days, to procure, it was impossible to move. Maria and her grandson Leo stood apart from the others. The boy was crying silently, his small face buried in his grandmother's skirt. Maria simply looked at the statue, her expression one of profound sorrow, not for the broken plan, but for the sacred image lying in the mud. She looked at Elias, and there was no blame in her eyes, only a deep, unsettling pity that he found more infuriating than any accusation. As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, the group disbanded in disarray. The mayor stormed off to make phone calls. The parishioners retreated to the church to pray, casting worried glances back at the fallen statue and the lone figure of the engineer who stood beside it. Elias was left alone with his failure, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He was isolated, trapped between the unmovable object and the unstoppable force of the approaching train. The storm was breaking, and he was at its center. The rain came down in sheets, a gray curtain that blurred the world into a wash of muted colors. From his signal box, Elias watched the statue. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief, brilliant flashes of light, the white marble seemed to glow with an eerie luminescence. The wind howled around his small outpost, rattling the windows like an angry spirit. It was a night of elemental fury, a perfect mirror for the tempest raging inside his own soul. He had tried everything a rational man could. He had attempted to use levers, long steel bars from his workshop, to pry the statue's base from the mud's grip. He had strained against it until his muscles screamed, the wet ground offering no purchase. The marble did not budge. It was as if the earth itself had claimed it. It was a monument to his powerlessness. The storm worsened, and soon the telephone lines went dead. A crackle of static, then silence. He tried the radio, his link to the regional dispatch, but it was just a hiss of atmospheric noise. He was cut off. He was completely and utterly alone with the problem. The Starlight Express, the 9:15 passenger train, was out there somewhere, hurtling through the storm, its hundreds of passengers oblivious to the 2 tons of marble obstructing their path. He paced the confines of his small box like a caged animal. Every tick of the large clock on the wall was a hammer blow against his composure. He was a man of solutions, a man who bent steel and concrete to his will. But he could not move a single stone. He could not stop a train. He could not even call for help. All the certainties of his life, all the principles of engineering that had defined him, were useless against a freak accident and a wall of rain. His gaze kept returning to the statue. In the flashes of lightning, its pose seemed to change. One moment, it looked like a fallen victim. The next, its outstretched hand seemed to be a warning. He shook his head, angry at the tricks his mind was playing. It was grief and exhaustion, nothing more. Statues did not move. Statues did not warn. They were just stone. Then, a strange thing happened. Through the roar of the wind and rain, he caught a scent. It was faint at first, then stronger, a sweet, unmistakable fragrance that did not belong in a storm-ravaged railway yard. It was the scent of roses. Fresh, blooming roses. He remembered Anna's garden, how the air would fill with that same scent after a summer shower. The memory was so vivid, so painful, it brought him to his knees. He gripped the control panel, his knuckles white, trying to ground himself in the cold reality of his station. But the scent lingered, a ghostly perfume woven into the fabric of the storm. He stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, but this time, it was different. For a split second, the light around the statue was not the stark, cold white of electricity, but a soft, gentle blue. It was a light that did not sear the eyes but seemed to soothe them, a light that clung to the marble form like a cloak. Elias's heart hammered in his chest. A part of his mind, the engineer's mind, frantically searched for an explanation. A chemical reaction in the rain. An optical illusion caused by the lightning's frequency. St. Elmo's fire. But the other part of him, the part he had buried with Anna, knew. It knew, and it was terrified. The clock on the wall showed 9:07. The train was minutes away. Desperation, cold and absolute, finally washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his pride. He had no more levers to pull, no more calculations to make. He was a failure as an engineer, a failure as a protector. He saw the faces of the passengers in his mind, laughing, talking, sleeping, hurtling towards a disaster he was powerless to prevent. He thought of the boy, Leo, and how his small face would look when he learned what had happened. He looked at the statue one last time, no longer with scorn, but with a raw, desperate fury born of utter helplessness. He didn't pray. He did not know how. Instead, he screamed, his voice swallowed by the storm, a cry directed at the thing in the mud, at the memory of his wife, at the God he had abandoned. "Is this what you want?" he yelled, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Is this your grand design? To let them all perish for a piece of stone?" His challenge hung in the air, a final act of defiance against a silent heaven. And in that silence, after the thunder had rolled away, a voice answered. It was not in his ears, but in the very center of his mind. It was a woman's voice, gentle and clear, filled with a sorrow so profound it eclipsed his own. It was a voice that felt like a memory of love, like the essence of motherhood itself. It spoke only 5 words. The little ones must be safe. The voice was a key turning a lock deep inside him, a lock rusted shut by years of grief and anger. The little ones, it was what Anna used to say. She would watch the children playing in the churchyard, her face soft with affection. "Whatever happens, Elias," she would whisper, "the little ones must be safe." It was her prayer, her deepest conviction. And now, that same conviction was being spoken into the heart of his despair, a tender echo in the raging storm. The vision, the voice, it shattered him. The engineer, the man of reason, the skeptic, was gone. In his place was just a man, stripped bare of all his certainties. He fell to the floor of the signal box, the scent of roses overwhelming his senses. The memory of that soft blue light burned into his vision. The fight was over. He had spent years raging against a force he couldn't see, and now that he had finally felt it, he had no strength left to resist. He simply surrendered. A profound change swept through Elias as he pushed himself up from the floor. The fury that had been his constant companion for years had vanished, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. The weight of his grief was still there, but it no longer felt like an anchor dragging him to the bottom of the sea. It felt shared. He looked at his hands, calloused and trembling, and they seemed to belong to a different man. The world outside the window, once a hostile landscape, now appeared fragile and precious. He knew what he had to do. His duty was clear, not as an engineer bound by regulations, but as a man who had been given a message. He could not move the statue, and he could not stop the storm, but he could stand in the path of the train. He could be a warning. His first act as this new man was one of complete humility. He knelt on the cold, grimy floor of his signal box. He bowed his head, a gesture he had not made since he was a boy, and he prayed. The words were clumsy, rusty from disuse. He did not ask for his own safety. He did not ask for a miracle. He simply prayed for the people on the train, for the engineer who was guiding them through the night, for the children sleeping in their seats. He prayed for the little ones. It was Anna's prayer, and now it was his. Then he stood up, his purpose clear. He grabbed the emergency lantern, a heavy, oil-fueled lamp with a dark red lens. It was an archaic piece of equipment, a relic from a bygone era, his absolute last resort. He lit the wick, and its flame flickered to life, casting a warm, urgent glow against the storm-darkened glass. He burst out of the signal box and into the deluge. The wind tore at him, and the rain was cold as ice, but he barely felt it. His entire being was focused on the twin ribbons of steel that stretched into the darkness before him. He ran. He stumbled on the loose gravel of the railway bed, his boots slipping in the mud, but he did not fall. The red lantern swung wildly in his hand, its beam a frantic heartbeat in the night. Ahead of him, the statue was a pale shape in the gloom. He ran towards it, towards the very obstacle that had caused this crisis. And as he drew closer, he saw the light. It was not the lantern. It was the soft, impossible blue glow he had seen from the window, and it was now emanating directly from the marble figure. It was not a reflection. It was a light from within, a serene luminescence that pushed back against the violent darkness of the storm. Then he saw it move. It was not a sudden jolt or a fall. It was a slow, deliberate, and graceful shift. The 2-ton statue, half buried in mud and clay, began to tilt. It moved away from the track, a slow, majestic pivot as if guided by an unseen hand. There was a deep, groaning sound from the earth as mud and rock were displaced. The statue settled, sinking deeper into the soft ground beside the tracks, its body now completely clear of the railway line. It came to rest with a final, gentle sigh, the blue light fading until it was just white marble in the rain once more. Elias stopped in his tracks, his feet frozen to the ground. He stared, the red lantern hanging forgotten at his side. He had just witnessed the impossible, a direct violation of every physical law he held sacred. He saw the deep, raw trench in the mud where the statue's base had been moments before, a clear and undeniable testament to its movement. In the distance, he heard it, the mournful horn of the Starlight Express. A single bright headlight cut through the rain, growing larger and larger, a cyclops eye bearing down on him. The ground began to vibrate. The train was coming, far too fast to stop. But the way was clear. The locomotive thundered past him, a blur of lighted windows and screaming steel. The blast of its passage nearly knocked him off his feet. He saw faces in the windows, fleeting glimpses of ordinary lives, all of them safe, all of them protected. The train receded into the night, its red tail lights shrinking to pinpricks before vanishing completely. Elias Thorne stood alone in the rain, the silence rushing back in to fill the void. He slowly lowered the lantern. He looked at the statue, now resting peacefully in its new position, and then he looked up at the storm-tossed sky. The tears that came were not of grief or of fear, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like it could split his soul open. The dawn broke clear and clean, the sky washed new by the storm. The first rays of sun gilded the wet leaves and made the railway tracks gleam. The entire town of St. Jude's seemed to emerge with the light, drawn by a mixture of anxiety and morbid curiosity. They came to see the disaster. They came to see the wreckage. Instead, they found a miracle. They found the statue, nestled securely in the muddy embankment, inches from the track but entirely clear of it. They saw the deep, gouged out furrow in the ground that marked its impossible journey. There were no tracks from heavy machinery, no broken ropes, no sign of human effort. It had simply moved. And they found Elias. He was sitting on the ground beside the statue, his back resting against its solid marble base. He was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and utterly exhausted, but on his face was a look of deep, unshakable peace. He held the extinguished red lantern in his lap like a sacred relic. Mayor Thompson was the first to approach, his practical mind struggling to process the scene. He inspected the ground, walked the perimeter, and measured the distance from the statue to the rail. He kept shaking his head, muttering to himself. "It's not possible," he said, to no one in particular. "The physics, it's just not possible." Maria came next, with young Leo holding her hand. The boy, seeing the statue was safe, broke away from his grandmother and ran forward. He stopped before the Madonna and gently placed a single, mud-splattered wildflower he had picked at her base. It was a simple, innocent act of love. Maria looked from the statue to Elias, and her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of understanding. She walked over and placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. He looked up at her, and in his gaze, she saw that the angry, broken man was gone forever. The townspeople gathered in a hushed circle. The skeptics fell silent. The believers crossed themselves. They saw the evidence before them, an event that defied all explanation, and they understood that they were standing on holy ground. The story spread through the crowd in whispers, the story of the coming train, the failed radio, and the lone signalman who had stood watch. They looked at Elias not as the arrogant engineer who had failed them, but as the humble witness to a mystery. Later that day, Elias, with the help of the same men who had struggled before, helped to properly secure the statue. They did not try to move it again. They all agreed, without a word needing to be spoken, that it had found its new home. They built a new grotto around it, right there on the spot where it had chosen to rest, a permanent shrine by the side of the tracks. They cleaned the mud from its face and robes, but they left the base just as it was, sunk deep into the earth, a testament to the night the laws of heaven had superseded the laws of men. Elias Thorne did not return to designing bridges. His life had been given a new, quieter purpose. He remained the signalman at the St. Jude's crossing, but his post was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. He became the unofficial caretaker of the new grotto, ensuring fresh flowers were always present, just as Anna would have wanted. He didn't preach or lecture. He simply shared his story when asked, telling it with the simple humility of a man who knows he was shown something far beyond his own understanding. The statue became a landmark. Trains no longer thundered past St. Jude's. Engineers, knowing the story, would slow their speed and sound their horns in a brief, respectful salute. The community itself was transformed. The shared miracle had healed old divisions and rekindled a forgotten warmth. The church filled on Sundays, not with people driven by obligation, but with those drawn by a renewed sense of wonder. Elias often sat by the statue in the quiet evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky. He no longer felt alone. He felt a profound connection to the wife he had lost, to the community he had found, and to the gentle, loving presence that had reached through a storm to save a train full of strangers. He had started as a man of steel and concrete, a believer only in what he could measure. He had become a man of faith, a believer in the quiet, powerful miracles that lay just beyond the limits of human sight, waiting for a heart broken enough to finally see them.